Now, in recent years, identity politics have become a dominant force in political as well as social discourse. While some people believe that it is a force for good and to reach equality, some people argue that it can undermine social cohesion and liberal democracy. Now, in his latest book, The Identity Trap, Professor Mounk explored the complexity of this issue, analyzing how ideas about identity shape power dynamics today. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss freedom and trap of identity politics is Yascha Mounk, Professor of the Practice of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you very much.
So, I have something that I have to admit. When I first heard about the topic of the discussion, I assumed that you are a right-wing speaker because this has become one of the talking points for right-wing, be it politicians or personalities, in pointing out the dangers of said identity politics. But somehow it doesn't seem to be working so well on the left side of the aisle. Can you help us break that down a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, I can clear up that confusion. I'm, joined the German Social Democratic Party. I grew up in Germany when I was 13 years old, so I've been officially a member of the left since I was 13, and I remain a member of the left. I remain very worried about the rise of populists, in part on the left in places like Venezuela or Mexico, but often on the right, in everywhere from India to Turkey to the United States. So I very much am not a right-wing speaker, but I do worry about the rise of a kind of identitarian ideology on the left for two reasons. One is that it's actually part of the explanation for why left-wing parties and moderate parties have been losing in so many places, why they've created a political opening for those right-wing populists. And the second is that many of these ideas are themselves bad, that they are doing damage to our society and actually making it less likely that we will be able to build a society of true equals, a society in which members of a country from different groups are able to look each other in the eyes and have a true sense of civic friendship, are able to have the same opportunities and rights as each other.
Right. In your panel speech, you mentioned that Trump, even though being very unpopular right now, doesn't seem to be losing in the polling number. And you argue that a lot of the left wing or people in the middle are feeling like the left is going too far to their left. And we can observe when it comes to polling numbers that even though being an African-American woman herself, Kamala Harris actually enjoys the least number of black supporters in this election cycle going forward. Do you think that perhaps what you mentioned earlier, this kind of identity trap, is some of the things that are driving these electors away?
Yes, absolutely. When you look at who believes in the ideas of wokeness, or as I prefer to say, the identity synthesis, in one interesting study they were called progressive activists of a particular sort, you see that they tend to be white, they tend to be affluent, and they tend to be highly educated. So sometimes there's this assumption that these ideas are the kind of organic demand from the bottom up of members of these minority groups that are growing as a portion of the US population. And there's just no evidence that that is the case. Now, as a result, Democrats believed that as the number of white Americans declines, as the number of non-white Americans grows, that's going to give them a sort of inevitable rising demographic majority. That is why many American media outlets thought that Hillary Clinton couldn't possibly lose to Donald Trump in 2016. And it's that what we've seen over the course of the last years is a real change in voting patterns in which precisely the African Americans, the Asian Americans, and particularly the Latinos that were supposed to vote for Democrats are now starting in larger and larger numbers to vote for Republicans. And the reason for that is that many of them are somewhat socially conservative, or they're moderate, perhaps they're moderately left-leaning even, but they feel that Democrats have taken on board a set of ideas, have focused so much on these academic ways of thinking about identity, can sometimes be so punitive when somebody uses the wrong term inadvertently, that they don't feel represented by them.
Right, and we see a lot of these kind of anti-wokeness idea pretty much co-opted by a very populist movement, and we're seeing that they're gaining a lot of traction due to that as well. Do you see as a key risk for freedom and democracy when kind of identity politics becomes central to the societal discussion?
One of the things that's, I think, important to understand is that in one way, right-wing nationalism and left-wing identitarianism play on the same musical instrument. Which is to
Right.
say that we have a basic psychological instinct to say you and I are part of the same group. And I might be willing to sacrifice for you. I might be willing to be altruistic. I might be willing to be really courageous in defending us. But those people over there, they are bad. They don't matter. To them, we can do whatever we want. Now, right-wing nationalism gives one way of justifying that psychological instinct. But forms of left-wing identitarianism give another way of justifying and sometimes encouraging that instinct. That is why I think it's so damaging if many schools in the United States today have teachers coming to classrooms where kids are 8 or 7 or 6 years old and saying the white kids are going to go into one classroom and the Latinos are going to go into a second classroom and the Asians are going to go into the third classroom and the African Americans are going to go into the fourth classroom. We're going to teach them that the purpose of a good progressive education is to have a right racial self-classification, is to have pride in the group you're from. I get why they're doing that. It's part of a theory of strategic essentialism, which is meant to encourage them to take on injustices and to fight against the ways in which they might genuinely be discriminated against in society. But what it's actually going to do is to lead to forms of zero-sum conflict between different identitarian blocks in our society. And a lot of those white kids are not going to turn into social justice warriors, they're going to turn into right-wing populists who define by the skin color, by the fact that they're part of a white group. And so that's just one of the ways in which these two ideologies that look opposed to each other actually help each other. What we need is a return to the basic philosophically liberal, universalist principles that have actually founded our successful democracies. The idea that we should have civic friendship with each other, we should have solidarity with each other, irrespective of a group we're from. But I'm going to stand up for you if you're discriminated against, because that's not right. But we want a society in which my rights and duties and your rights and duties do not depend on the kind of ethnic group into which we're born.
Right. So how do we balance not falling into this identity trap, but still kind of having the racial representation and racial justice that the liberal democracy also depends very much upon?
Well, I think that's very simple, which is that we have those disparities as a result of historical factors, as a result of discrimination. But actually, members of these different groups are very talented. And once you remove those obstacles, they are able to succeed. Look at the history of Asian Americans in the United States, many of whom came from very poor backgrounds, with no particular advantages in the United States, with no inside track. And they've been able to do phenomenally well. So the way we do that is certainly through anti-discrimination laws, certainly for making sure that companies don't discriminate in the hiring, certainly by making sure that we don't have any formal disabilities in what people are able to do, but not by making the way we treat each other always dependent on the kind of group from which we hail.
Right. Now, when you open up your panel speech, you mentioned describing yourself as sort of a liberal democracy hipster for being worried about liberal democracy before it was cool. So now that I'm hoping to get a little bit of your insight and perhaps kind of look another 10, 20 years down the line, are there anything that currently also poses a threat to the future of liberal democracy that perhaps can be nit in the bud?
Well, I do think that to have thriving liberal democracies, we have to renew and redouble our commitment to its fundamental values. And we need to actually be able to see what we've accomplished. Our societies are imperfect, like every society in the world. We often fail to live up to our principles, like every society in history. But when I look at how Poland has developed over the last 30 years, for example, I think many people in the country are too pessimistic about where they're at. Look at how much more affluent a country is. Look at what which looks like today compared to what it would have looked like 30 or 40 years ago. Look at much of the progress we've made on questions like inclusion of different groups in society as well. When you look around the globe, some of the richest countries in the world, some of the countries that people most would want to immigrate to, some of the countries that have the highest human development index, all turn out to be liberal democracies. So I think part of what we have to do is to fight for these values. And those values were always progressive with a small p, which is to say they always recognize that our societies are imperfect and that we have to improve them. But they always said the way to improve them is to live up to our values, not to give up on them.
Right, you did mention something, kind of drawing parallel to history, where a lot of times bringing people on board doesn't necessarily mean alienating the other, but drawing kind of attention to the things that people have in common instead of what separate us apart. Can you help us reiterate that for audiences?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the examples of this is Frederick Douglass, one of the great figures in American history, somebody who was born into slavery and was one of the most important fighters for the abolition of slavery. And he was invited to give a speech on the 4th of July, the American national holiday, addressing his compatriots. And he started by telling them that they're hypocrites. Here you are talking about how lovely it is that in the Declaration of Independence it says we're all free and equal, while some people are enslaved on the basis of the color of their skin. But he didn't say, therefore, you should give up on your principles. Therefore, this idea is ridiculous. He said, if you're serious about that principle, then you have to live up to it, then you actually have to free the slaves, and you have to abolish slavery. He didn't say that freedom of speech, as many people tend to say today, is somehow the wrong value because some people can say terrible things. He said freedom of speech is a dread of tyrants because it's also what allows the most marginalized in societies, the people who are truly unpopular, to make their voices heard. People at the time, like abolitionists, who wanted to fight against the institution of slavery. Another example is the movement for gay and lesbian rights over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. When you talk to people who wrote some of the most influential essays arguing for the idea of gay marriage, for example, they will tell you that the first fight was inside the gay and lesbian community. Because there's people who said, we don't want to get married, that's for heterosexuals, that's nothing to do with us, we want to destroy that institution. And it was the people who said, no, want to be included in the institution. There's nothing wrong with the institution other than the fact that it discriminates against us, who ultimately won the day and who've been able to win inclusion in society and change attitudes towards gays and lesbians in a really radical way over the course of the last decade. So I think that we can fight for inclusion, we can fight for fairer societies on the basis of these universalist values.
Right, and perhaps focus more on what brings us together than what separates us apart. Thank you so much, sir. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, bardzo dziękuję.
And thank you so much for watching this edition of World Talks. My guest was Yascha Mounk, professor and author of The Identity Trap. Please check it out. And in the meantime, for more news, update, and commentary, stay tuned to TVP World.